Thanks very much, Mihai. Thanks for the invitation. This has been a great session so far, and a really important session as well. So we went to some of the big hitter databases earlier this year, and we asked two questions. So the databases we went to, I'll talk a little bit about the GCBR designation in a moment. But the database we went to are the ones that in the bioinformatics world we use all the time. They're the deposition databases, the knowledge bases, fairly generalist often, but we have model organism databases in the set, and various well-known names. And we asked them these two questions. And the first question was, so we want to know about staffing. How many people were working on how many people did you have, FTEs, working on your data resource up until now? And so you see on the left-hand side of this, up until the dotted line, this is the who they had in the past. And we add the numbers together. And it's sort of 600, between 600 and 700. It's been fairly stable. So we're sort of assuming that it has so far, recently, it's taken that many people to run the database. That's sort of what you need. That's the starting point. And then with the second question was, well, so looking at your situation now with the funding streams you have, how many FTEs, how many positions will you have next year, the following year, or this year, next year, the following year, and so on. And we got the numbers and we added them together. And what you see is that so currently, the current year when we asked the question, yeah, things are okay. We're sort of close to the numbers we were running on in previous years. The following year, well, we're dropping quite significantly, quite quickly. By 2027, we are way down, and we're about halfway. So we have a sort of, we get to 50% of our current staffing numbers within 4 years. So there's a 4-year window here. And if you're trying to run a data resource that you want to be persistent and you want this to be useful for often decades, and many of them have been around for decades, if you want to plan your procurement, your staffing, you want staff to develop, you want to train, you want to build a community, you can't be strategic about that if you have a 4-year window. So this is just one of the challenges that is facing data resources and the data infrastructure. And I'll come back to some more of the challenges. But what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about the infrastructure as a whole, say a few things about GBC, and then I'm going to raise some questions that will sort of reflect back on some of the things that we've been discussing today, and particularly relate to some of Christoph's criticisms. And so these hopefully will be discussion points we might pick up later as well. So the data infrastructure is a set of many different data resources, and they exist globally. So they're not in any one place. They're all around the world. We think there are something like 4,000. It depends how we heard a number earlier of sort of 6,000, 7,000. It depends how you define things, but let's talk about 4,000. And we think of the sort of the more generic, very heavily used, larger data resources in this GCBR block, and I'll come on to talk about that. And then we think of this long tail, and as you go to the right, you get more and more specialist, more and more nuanced, but still important, and particularly important for particular communities. But it's these databases, they're distributed around the world, and they're very interconnected. So often the data deposition database is the primary place where data are pushed from the scientific community, and they're picked up in all sorts of different ways and curated and processed by secondary databases. And then there are tertiary databases, quaternary databases. So there's a whole network. And so if you damage any part, you damage a lot of the network. And if all the parts that you need are healthy, then you have a healthy network. Now, this is an audience, so I don't need to explain how important all of this is. And we heard about some of the economic values of this, but wherever you look, and this is a few of the impact studies that we've done. You look at childhood cancer, you look at the economy, you look at biodiversity loss and conservation and so on. You look at public health, you look at other areas of human disease. Wherever you look, there are impacts, things that have been really important for society, benefits important for society, that you can track back to data, and you can track back to data resources. So it's a really important infrastructure. And the key thing is that everyone is, and I'll come back to this as well, everyone who's doing research is using this in some way. They're certainly all pulling data from it, or they're using knowledge that are derived from data from it, or they're pushing data into it, and usually they're doing several of those things. However, there are risks. And the first one is that, the staffing and the opportunity to plan strategically for staffing across the the big hitter resources is one issue, but the funding for these data resources over the years has been very poorly coordinated or not coordinated. It's often very short term. It often comes from a single source that it's not resilient to change and to buffering and to political change. And it's often, as we heard, part of a research program where you have to fit a research agenda, which is often more about developing new methodology and not so much about operating and continuing and developing things in a way that make them sustainable and continue the service that's required of these resources. So there are a lot of challenges to the system, and they threaten and there's a risk that one of the components goes or it's reduced in its activity, and then not only will it go and a lot of users be affected, a lot of things that could happen not happen, it will have an impact on the rest of the ecosystem, so the whole infrastructure will be damaged. And then, of course, that's a negative way of looking at it, but of course there's this great opportunity, because if we get this right, we're in an era of intense data science. Data production is getting more intensive. There's a big move for openness. Data science, AI, modern methods can do all sorts of extraordinary things. We have great opportunity, but if we don't have the infrastructure to support it, we won't be able to realize those opportunities. There's a second risk. I'll say more about this, but this is a risk that relates to what could become, perhaps is already becoming, a fragmentation around the world, relating to the nature of where people are producing and consuming data, which is global, it's ubiquitous, but where the data resources and the scientific investment is focused in the past. So there are global geopolitical and trust issues, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So introduce the Global Biodata Coalition at this point. So the GBC was really set up to address these issues of sustainability in the data infrastructure. It's a coalition of life science, biomedical, biodiversity funding organizations, and they come together. They recognize the importance of this infrastructure for their research programs. They understand the fragility of the different parts. They understand that it's not supported as an infrastructure should be, and then they commit to working together to find ways that they might better cooperate and find solutions to this. And so we have 11 different funding organizations that are members, and then at any one time we have a set of observers who are, we hope, on a path to membership. So I'm just going to say a little bit about how we do things. So the Global Core Biodata Resource Program, so these databases in that peak that I mentioned, we run a selection process. We've done it twice so far, where we invite people who run data resources to submit and describe their resource. And there's an evaluation by an external expert committee that's independent, that looks at a set of defined criteria. And we're looking for quality of service, integrity, professionalism, technical ability, and all sorts of really key and value to the community, the user community. So we're looking at a number of criteria, and we define this set of data resources. So these are the ones that they're particularly well connected within the infrastructure. So disruption to these core data resources would have a particularly big impact on other core resources and on other parts of the ecosystem. But it also gives us a very good group with whom we can communicate, and we can explore what might work better, and we can ultimately evaluate things and test them out. So if we come up with better ways for funding organizations to cooperate, then this will be the group that can really put things to the test and help to develop that. So we have a forum of the leaders of these data resources that get together. We work on various different things, and we talk about many things. So elements of sustainability, so defining what it means to be, this is just one example, but defining what it means to be a data resource. Or a sustainable data resource in our domain is one thing we need to get clear, because it's not necessarily agreed what sustainability means when a data resource is talking to a funder. So we work on impact studies. I mentioned those. We do bits of campaigning here and there, and you'll see things hopefully on social media and so on. We do a lot of engaging funding organizations, explaining what this infrastructure is. I think we heard early this morning, Alex had pictures of bits of infrastructure that people don't think about the infrastructure until something happens, and for us that will be too late when it does happen. So a lot of the funding, the high level decision makers are not so familiar with this infrastructure, and what's at risk and what the opportunities are. So we spend a lot of time engaging and trying to bring people on board. And I mentioned the white paper in a couple of on the next slide, actually. So we have a scientific part of the program. Because of the way data resources have emerged in this global set, it's very organic. Typically, people start to work on a laboratory method. They develop a system for producing data. It becomes a platform. Lots of other people start to use it. They start to run a database. Suddenly people they don't know come and contact them and say, we want to access a database. And so it starts very informally and it's ground up. But some of the biggest databases we have now, they've come from a background where there were a few enthusiasts, and it's grown and grown and grown and become a major asset and a major part of the infrastructure. I mean, that explains why it doesn't have so much of the top-down coordination, but it also makes our job harder in explaining it and justifying it to funders, because as any investor reasonably asks, so you're asking us to invest in something, but what is it? What are we investing in, and how will it change? What will the return on our investment be? So we spend a lot of time trying to understand this organically undescribed system. And I just put out a few facts here because I think that there's some quite compelling statistics we end up with. So it turns out that 37.5 million people have been authors or co-authors of papers in which there's at least one citation from nearly all countries, been at least one citation of a record from a global core biodata resource. So that's a huge number of people who have some connection to GCBRs. If we look recently, so half of all papers in the infectious disease domain, in the pathogen domain, over the last 10 years, cite at least one record to a global core biodata resource. So 50% of the publications in that domain are using the GCBRs in some way. We know that all countries use GCBRs. We learn some other things. So the number of data resources is growing, and this is so running the inventory we run to discover data resources. If we run it in consecutive years, we find that this number is growing. We don't know why that is, and we're looking for the things that are being deprecated or just going offline. So we're accounting for that. But from that scan, we know that there are something like 17,000 different funding sources for the data that are actually paying for the data resources in some way. So that gives us a huge set of people that we have to somehow engage with. So this is there's a big task, but there are a lot of people who are implicated in this in different ways. So I'll talk about the white paper. So we started with the members, so the funding organizations and the members of GBC set up working groups that some of the board members were there, but appointing people to these working groups from the funding organizations, but also a few people from outside the funding organizations to talk about different issues. And one of the issues was sustainability. And a consultation paper was produced, and we had various rounds of input from different communities, from curation communities, from service providing communities, and so on. And we came up with a paper that was published earlier this year. I do encourage you to read that. In there, we have 9 foundational principles that relate to thinking, how one should approach building a cooperative system, a global system for supporting infrastructure. And then we start to look at some of the mechanisms, and I'll dip into a few of these things. So I'll spend a bit of time on the principles. Let me introduce some of these questions. So the 9 principles relate to, in red, they're talking about the funding organizations and their interaction with the system. Flexibility comes in one of the principles, accessibility and visibility of data, a few principles there, and then the governance and strategy, another set of principles. And I'm going to step through just a few of these because they introduce some interesting questions. So principles 1 and 2. So principle 1 is life science funders share responsibility for sustaining data resources. All life science funders. Principle 2 is all life science funders contribute to data resource sustainability. The thinking here is, so we talk about funding organizations, and it's true that our membership is currently, the membership of GBC is currently nationally linked, so government linked funding agencies, so traditional academic funders, and we have a couple of large foundations. But arguably anyone who is running a life science or a biomedical research program, the work they're funding will necessarily have a dependence on the infrastructure. So whether you're a grant-giving body, paying people in universities and research institutes to work, or you're a pharmaceutical company paying people in your R&D department to do their research work, or you're a small philanthropy or a private donor who's paying for some research work to happen. Your research program, will only succeed if we have a healthy infrastructure here. And so that means that for the GBC, a funding organization, we have to have a very broad definition. So, certainly looking at the private sector, and there's a lot of discussion about how you get a healthy and productive engagement from the private sector. And there are good examples of where that works, but there's more to develop there. But also international, supranational organizations. So, what about UNESCO? What about OECD? What about G7? So there are groupings that necessarily care about the productivity of research and what it brings to society and why it's important. And all of these they're on the hook. They have a stake, and they're dependent. So these are people we wish to engage as in GBC. So the next one, so principles 8 and 5. So 8, these talk about openness. So 8 focuses that biodata resources should make data and metadata as open as possible, as closed as necessary. 5 is about payment at the point of use. So it should be a last resort that people have to pay for data at the point of use. So these are slightly different aspects, but so maybe I should have said free and open. But so one question that came up in the panel on the session, the BOSC session on Tuesday, was this: is open the enemy of sustainability? And because the minute you don't have openness, you have opportunity to do lots of things, like charging people, for example, or having other in-kind obligations in some way. I don't believe we should allow it to be open to be the enemy of sustainability, but it's a lot of work to balance these two things, and it comes up increasingly. The reason I say that is that there's no question to me that open has been really productive and valuable. The fact that things can flow without friction around this ecosystem, the fact that we're talking about error propagation, but most of the things that are propagated are not errors. All of those flows are very low friction. The minute you start to close things, you have to have so much more in the system. So the openness and the ability to redistribute and to mix and to reinterpret has been really important and really fruitful. So we shouldn't give up on that easily. But I think we need a culture change, and so we think that the data are certainly valuable. So there are suggestions that, well, then you should charge for the data. But we also need to think about other ways of realizing that value. And so one way of doing that is to think, well, and we heard about the COARA work, it's not just the publication that's important. But when you publish a paper, you get a great deal more credit than you do when you submit a data set, or when you do a piece of curation, or even when you write a piece of software. So we sort of hold the paper's important. It's the narrative around what you're doing, but the whole value chain and the contributions leading up to it important. And I think if we can have better attribution systems and better credit systems, and we can bring about that culture change, we help to show the value of the data and the value of the things around the data. And so we help to address this, address the value and start to leverage it. So this idea, this protection against global fragmentation. And so data are produced, the methods we have are used around the world. The molecular biology has become much more important. It has much more societal impact and potential societal impact than it did before. So everyone cares about it. Everyone's using it. Most are producing data. Most are retrieving data. So it's a globally ubiquitous concern. Yet, while the science can advance more quickly in certain parts of the world because of greater investment and higher economies, while the infrastructure is run in parts of the world and controlled in parts of the world that are biased towards Europe, North America, and so on, there is a growing mistrust and a difficulty engaging and a risk, and it's actually already happening, that people build alternative infrastructure and it doesn't connect. And if we don't integrate, we don't allow the ecosystem to connect properly, then there's a great risk to science. It won't be as valuable, won't be as important. So we heard earlier today about the care principles, for example. So how do you do data governance in a way that really works for people and addresses people's sensitivities, but still allows the science to happen? And so models that are more inclusive, I would argue, for running the infrastructure. So one of the one of the models we suggest in the white paper is that you think about distributing the provision of the infrastructure. And I'm going to go to so I spend some of my time working at the European Bioinformatics Institute running ENA, the sequence database, and then I'm here representing Global Biodata Coalition. But I'm going to go to an example from my other work. This is the ISDC, it's the International Sequence Database Collaboration. It's just one I know. I mean, there are other examples that are doing the same thing. So we have traditionally, we are the US, Europe, plus Japan, but there are many other people involved in using sequence data around the world and running sequence databases. And so we've revised our legal framework and our technical framework that we can now invite new organizations around the world that are running sequence databases to become members and ultimately to become full members and equal partners in this. This is really powerful, and it's a powerful argument for sustainability and for trust, because it means that everyone is part of this. They're all running it. There's no, they're not handing over control. But it also deals with sustainability and financial sustainability, because people want national funding organizations, for example, want to invest in their own countries. They want to have buildings and people. They want capability and capacity. And so if you can coordinate scientifically, but run different parts of a data resource or the infrastructure in different places, this is one of the models that I think will become really important. So we have currently in ISDC, we have 3 prospect members from very different economies that will be, we hope, joining. So just to finish, we've heard a lot about this. So the strategy, the funding structures have to change, but actually the way we do the infrastructure isn't perfect either. So we need to think about how to change this. We need an ecosystem overall that can identify the gaps. If we're over redundant, we're not cost effective. There are gaps. We're not providing the services and the resources that are needed for everyone. But the system needs to be resilient. We don't want to remove all redundancy. It needs to be resilient in various ways. It needs to be agile. So if a new technology emerges or a scientific or a societal need emerges, we need to be able to fill that gap and provide something quickly. That will require coordination between the data resources. We've had a lot about data resource life cycling, and so the large, the service portfolio providers, the NCBI, SIB, EBI, and increasingly DSMZ, are dealing with this. They have programs to do this, but we have to sort of make those uniform across all of the data resources. So finally, for GBC, where we go next, so we now have some suggested cooperative mechanisms for funding. We have an important workshop coming up in a month where we're inviting people from the world of economics, so outside the life science community, people from the world of economics, behavioral science, and others. Phil's will be talking in a moment and is sort of involved in organizing this as well. So people coming from different disciplines to look at this challenge that we have in the life sciences and see what they can offer. So we broaden and hopefully get new ideas into it through that. We have a meeting later in the year to bring that together, and we are hoping to deliver a program in which we start to pilot and explore and demonstrate some of these ideas that have come through about better ways to support the infrastructure. And so with that, I leave it. One of our campaigns, it's really important to show that people care about this. So we have an open letter that you can sign as an individual or as an organization. Please do consider doing that. I'll leave that for a second, but it's on the website. It's really important that we can show that there are a lot of people who work in and around and depend on this.
Thank you so much.